Color Cargo is the result of an invitation from the Center for Art in Wood to create work for a solo exhibition here at the center. Knowing that the Center for Art in Wood is an organization that has been documenting and encouraging and nurturing the development of contemporary art, craft, and design in the material of wood, does that inform the context or contextual reading of the work in the show?
Yeah, so I think one of the interesting things about being in a space like this is that, you know, we're in a space that's dedicated to the history of wood, not just as a material, but I think also as like a subject matter. And that's kind of where I'm really sort of trying to key in with this work. I've been making work out of wood for a while now, and like the plexiglass that I use for the work, a lot of it is about sort of using materials that I think are really tactile and seductive and draw you in as a way to sort of open up these conversations that, you know, people don't always want to have. One of the interesting things about being here is that this space for a long time has really sort of championed craft in wood. And I'm sort of interested in sort of helping further this parallel conversation that the space is doing about wood as a conceptual device and wood that has the potential to create all these other conceptual conversations. So, yeah. So this is the show, Color Cargo. It's sort of been a show that's been in the making for a few years now. It's been this idea swirling around in my head, just figuring out a way to have a conversation about what does it mean to move objects, and then think about like all the different ways in which objecthood can manifest itself. So we're having a conversation about artifacts, but we're also having a conversation about people moved as objects, and that's really kind of like the main thrust of what the show is about. So thinking about not just you know, bodies moved as enslaved people through history, but also thinking about the crate as an object that has the potential to sort of be transportive and transformative in you obtaining your freedom. So we're in Philly right now at the Center for Art in Wood, and one of the sort of more interesting stories related to Philadelphia is the story of Henry Box Brown, who was a slave or an enslaved person who shipped himself to freedom in a crate. So I'm liking the idea of figuring out a way to kind of tap into the ambiguousness of the box and think about the ways in which we can imagine all the myriad things that can go inside the box and our understanding of how those things relate to our everyday lives, or not, you know.
And there were also questions of value that come from the things that we decide to encase and ship and move around.
Yes.
And crates figure into that as well.
Yeah, I think there's also this conversation about, like, you know, again, the way that we assign value to objects and how you can signal value through all these different things. So, especially when we're talking about objects that are worth putting in crates, we're talking about the crate as an object that has the potential to signal wealth, high value, preciousness, sophistication, all these sort of different things. And how do you use that object, the crate, as a way to sort of signal all of those things? I'm really interested in using this lexicon of shapes that I've been developing for myself over time. So in the show, with several of the works, those shapes get affixed onto the crates as a way of functioning almost as like luxury labels, or as a way of kind of elevating the crate to an object that you can imagine serving as a luxury good in its own right, the same way that you have a Tiffany's box or or what are some of the other,
Louis Vuitton.
Louis Vuitton, all these other luxury goods that use packaging and encasing as a way to signal value. And I think that that speaks to a larger conversation about the way that we sort of encase ourselves as a way of signaling value. How do we sort of assign ideas of sophistication or worth to the things that we adorn on ourselves? And I think the crate becomes this sort of abstract way of having that conversation.
Could you talk about the color palette?
Yeah, so I love using color. This is like a very colorful show. But for this show specifically, all of the colors are drawn from the Luscher color test, which is, I consider sort of a pseudo-scientific way of measuring somebody's personality through, basically the way the test works is you have this collection of 8 swatches and you're then instructed to pull from each swatch based solely on your emotion or from instinct. And then the logic is that through the order in which you pull these colors, there's something about your psychological state that can be inferred. This particular test sort of relies heavily on shared cultural understanding of what these various shapes can mean and what these colors mean in relationship to an individual person, and that's kind of where I'm trying to sort of push back on, because my belief is that any system that's rooted in a sort of asserted like universality of anything is kind of wrong from the start. I think that if we exist in a space where we understand that everybody's coming from a multitude of perspectives, from a multitude of experiences, that's when we can start to really begin the connective tissue through language and through communication, not through this sort of assumption that we all have the same lived experience and the same relationships to the things that are going on around us. This is something that like Stuart Hall talks about a lot. So the various crates are all the various colors in the Luscher color test, and then there are wall pieces, which are sort of more traditional versions of what I do using laser cut plexiglass, CNC milled wood, that function as abstracted interpretations of what the Luscher color test asserts that these colors mean. So the hope is that there's going to be like some slippage and there's going to be some breakdown in our understanding of what these things are supposed to mean and how our relationship to these particular shapes that are getting deployed in the work might add some friction to that.
Could you talk a little bit about your relationships to the shapes and how they developed and their historical significance versus or also their personal significance?
Yeah, so the various shapes, I should step back and say I'm really interested in developing this visual language or this lexicon of shapes that is directly about sort of understanding the ways in which we mark people, places, and things as Black. And that happens colloquially, culturally, aesthetically, all these different things. So the shapes that I develop for myself, and that's like an extremely slow process, sometimes it can take like months, years to settle on a particular shape. They're all influenced by either historical references, iterations of representations of Black people in cultures around the world, my own lived experience, and then just sort of general pop culture. So each story kind of has a different narrative around how it came to be, but the hope is that those things kind of start to collapse and fall to the wayside when the viewer is confronted with them and the viewer is asked to sort of use their own lived experience to start reconciling what all these shapes mean in relationship to each other. Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about Blackamoor's?
Series? Yeah, I guess I should have like prefaced all of this with that. But yeah, so this body of work, the Blackamoor's collages, started off as a direct investigation on the Blackamoors in Italy, which is this large, decorative subculturally that uses the black body as an aesthetic trope for object making. So at the same time that all of these sort of classical sculptures were being made of like white figures, the same types of figures that we see in museums, these other objects were being made alongside. In some instances, if a particular sculpture was deemed like a failure, it would literally get painted black and turned into these blackamoors. So often you'll see objects of black bodies in servitude designed to be objects that function some kind of utilitarian purpose, like a crate. So originally the first sort of shapes or symbols were directly influenced by that type of imagery. And I've allowed the work since then to evolve past that. So it's really been about using the blackamoors as an aesthetic trope, but then thinking about all the other ways in which we construct language through shapes. So you'll see some shapes related to like Egyptology or various forms of currency, various forms of power, forms of protection, forms that adorn the body, forms directly related to the body, and more contemporary images like hoodies or Afro picks, things that can invoke a more direct relationship to the various things that are inflicted on the black body or that affect the black body or that politicize the black body. Yeah.
From that point, could you talk a little bit about intersectional understandings and readings of this?
Yeah. I think that it's super important for us to, again, recognize that people are approaching art and objects and life from a multitude of perspectives. And the hope is that with these works, that acknowledgement kind of can bubble up to the surface. So there's this language of shapes, then there's this language of, how would I say it? There's sort of this compositional thing that's going on that's about this sort of direct rejection of typical tropes in art presentation. And when I say that, what I mean is I'm very dedicated to maintaining a practice that's about sort of questioning these like very base level conventions in the way that art is thought about or just presented. So questions like, does it all have to be right angles? Does it have to be in a frame? Can things come off the plane? Is there a way for the object to feel simultaneously like a painting and like a collage and like a sculpture? Figuring out a way to kind of collapse these labels on top of themselves and almost queer them in a way that's not relying on the sort of typical aesthetics of queerness. And that's something that's like really important to me, like offering alternatives to sort of queer aesthetics, but then also offering alternatives to the aesthetics of protest. So when we think about art that exists as protest art, it often is considered very didactic, it's considered very direct and to the point. And I'm really interested in figuring out another way of having these political conversations that's about seduction and about the use of materials that have a very tactile quality that invite you in order to create a space where we can have more difficult conversations with people that might not always want to have those conversations. Yeah. Oh, is that everything? Is that the end?